All right. So what I want to do today is two things. This afternoon we'll do forms in Rails. This morning, this may be super interesting. This may be super boring. But basically, it's just like a walkthrough of Rails. Like the thing that I find that people are most terrified by of Rails is just how many files there actually is and how much stuff there is. The reality is the vast majority of it you don't need to worry about. So mostly what I want to do today is just walk through and tell you all the stuff that you can ignore so that you don't have to freak out when you are looking at a Rails project. And then hopefully we kind of use the 80-20 principle and say, okay, what stuff is actually important? Let's talk about that. Let's figure out what that stuff is. And then we'll realize that it's not really a lot of stuff and we can relax and just enjoy it. Does anybody know how to create a new Rails project? Did anybody do that yesterday?
Rails new.
Awesome. So this is analogous to what in Sinatra? Typing Rails new something. Requiring Sinatra? Sort of.
Isn't that like running the Ratpack?
Yeah, it's like running Ratpack. So it's like cloning some Sinatra app generator, right? Like with Sinatra, you don't necessarily have to use all those files. With Rails. They give you like a core set of files. So they wrote these things called generators, which are literally just shell commands in a file that generate all the files you need, which is the exact same thing as like Ratpack or any other Sinatra Bootstrap sort of generator thing. So I'll just make Rails new intro, and then we can walk through the files. I wrote up a whole bunch of notes. I wanted to give you guys these notes, but my formatting got lost when I tried to throw it in a gist. So I'll find some way to share this with you, so you don't have to worry about like typing out everything that I'm saying. Most likely, anything I say is going to be in this file, so it's probably better to just kind of like pay attention to what I'm saying rather than worrying about typing. All right, cool. So let's look at what happened. So I wrote Rails new intro, and Rails has this nice little formatting thing where it says, okay, here's all the stuff I did for you, right? So it literally created all of these files from the command line for me, and then it runs bundle install for me, right? Bundle installs using the gem file, installs all my gems for me. So these are all the gems that come default with Rails. So then I can see into the project that Rails created for me, and I can look at what did I get. Oops. There we go. Cool. All right, so let's start walking through this stuff. First thing that we can talk about is stuff that's similar to Sinatra. Does anybody see anything in this sort of like basic file structure that reminds them of Sinatra, either similar or exact? Alex?
Like in most of the library, like the directories are the same names, or like apps would be a file instead of a directory.
Yeah, so a lot of this stuff looks really similar, and it looks really similar because we kind of have these conventions when we're developing web apps. So a lot of this stuff is not that different. So we have config.ru. This is literally the exact same file that you have in Sinatra. Or I would assume all web frameworks in Ruby are Rack based and compatible with Rack. So this works the exact same way as it does in Sinatra. The gem file, just the exact same thing we have in Sinatra, although Rails comes pre-installed with a whole bunch of gems. So let's just like run through these really quick and talk about what they are. This is actual Rails. In the past, Rails was one big gem. When they went from Rails 2 to Rails 3, they broke it down into a whole bunch of pieces. So if you actually look at like what Rails is, it's really like 5 gems now. And the whole idea there was Rails was kind of this big monolithic web framework. It had all this awesome stuff in it, and a lot of people wanted to use just some of it, not all of it, or people wanted to use pieces of that in like different web frameworks. So they tried to break it down and make it more modular. Some people were upset about that. Some people really like that. I think it's a great thing. There's some cool gems inside of Rails like active support, which gives you all sorts of nice things that you end up using all the time in a Rails app that you might want to use just in regular Ruby. So it's cool to sort of like look through some of that stuff. If you're using SQLite, you need the SQLite gem. If you're using Postgres, you need the PG gem. Anybody know what SCSS is? SAS. Yeah, SAS is a preprocessor. So you can write like kind of a nicer version of CSS, and then it will get compiled into CSS for you. So you need this gem to do that for you. Ugliflyer will compile your JavaScript stuff. So Ugliflyer and Coffee Rails are things that allow you to write in CoffeeScript. So CoffeeScript was developed after people in the Rails community started using JavaScript and kind of hated JavaScript and the syntax of JavaScript. And so somebody said, can we write a language that basically is JavaScript, but that has sort of like the feel of Ruby? So they wrote CoffeeScript, and CoffeeScript you have to compile, and it compiles down to JavaScript. And CoffeeScript is super nice, and it has this sort of like Ruby Railsy syntax, but is when it compiles down is JavaScript. jQuery is the most popular JavaScript library. So if you're using a JavaScript library in Rails by default, I think since like Rails 2-ish, it includes jQuery by default. This TurboLinks thing is something that DHH, the creator of Rails, was a big fan of to kind of combat the switch of a lot of people's web apps to mainly JavaScript MVC. I hate it. I find that if there's a problem in your app, it's probably TurboLinks. So I usually get rid of TurboLinks as soon as I start a new Rails project because I don't. I honestly have no idea. All I know is it screws up Rails apps. Its main function. It was like part of this idea of like PJAX. Like basically you have kind of this idea of like AJAX web apps that mainly use JavaScript, request data from the server, and then manipulate the web page using JavaScript. And then you have like Rails apps, which were just like completely server side. I send you HTML, that HTML is static. And TurboLinks was like, can we do something kind of smart in between and like only update like the page in a sort of like behind the scenes smart way without having to do a full refresh. So TurboLinks was kind of like this way of like, can we get the ease and niceness of these JavaScript MVC web apps that don't refresh the page all the time, so they load faster without going full JavaScript. I never really like paid attention to how exactly it works. Most people don't really use it, so I never really spent any time trying to figure out like how it's supposed to properly work. I'm sure there's a way to make it like work correctly. I am obviously somewhat joking about.
When you say you like remove it, you just remove the gym file, or like what if you like just didn't use it?
Yeah, so somewhere in here, I think it's in the layout file. Yes, this thing here is basically like, so this is the layout file, so this loads on every page, and it includes this style sheet link tag and this JavaScript include tag, which will generate script tags that will load TurboLinks into the page. So as long as these are here and the gem is in the gem file, you are using TurboLinks in the background, whether or not you like want to or know that you are. So I always come in here and remove well, you can use Command T to find anything, and it's the layout file, so it's application HTML ERB. So it's app views layouts application HTML ERB. If you come in here, I just remove this data TurboLinks track and data TurboLinks track JavaScript thing. Don't get rid of the whole style sheet because then you won't have any style, and you need the JavaScript file. But just removing this stuff will make your life typically a lot better.
I didn't know there's no way to like make Rails new.
Can you just make those false?
There may be. I've never looked into it.
Can you just make those false?
I don't know. I've never tried that either. Okay, so what's happened kind of in the popularity of ways people build web apps is Rails was like super popular as a way to make web apps. JavaScript became more popular, so people kind of like would put JavaScript and jQuery into their Rails apps. And there's been kind of like a recent push to have like a JavaScript MVC framework as your sort of front end, and have Rails be increasingly dumb kind of as the server, and have Rails serve as sort of just they call it a JSON API. So an API that's responsible for sending data to your sort of like front end, and have the front end do all the rendering of your HTML. So JBuilder is something that would help you with that. It allows you to, like, in the same way you use ERB to write HTML, you can use JBuilder to write like a JSON template. So if you had like a post model and you wanted to send JSON data, rather than writing that out like very specifically, you can use JBuilder as like a simpler sort of like templating language for JSON. By default, Rails uses WebRick, just like Sinatra, but you can use other web servers with it. Unicorn is a super popular one that you can use. I recommend using Thin. It's my favorite web server, and it's least likely to cause you any problems. Unicorn is awesome, but it's really more like a production web server, and in development, you're likely to run into issues because you don't really understand how it's working, and it's pretty complicated, but it's awesome. Capistrano is something that somebody wrote for super easy deployment. That was kind of before we had Heroku. Most people just use Heroku now. To deploy to Heroku, you just do git push, git push Heroku master. That's it. So Capistrano is like not as necessary today as it once was. In our development and test environment, this buy bug is just like pry. I looked at it yesterday. I've never actually used it before. We might as well stick with pry because we've been using pry. And then also there's this web console. This thing is cool, but I prefer using this thing called Better Errors. And you need, what is it called? Binding of caller. So if you add these two gems to the gem file, you get this awesome behavior that I will show you in a minute. So before we move on now, I want to compare the lifecycle of a request in Sinatra and the lifecycle of a request in Rails. So somebody just tell me in Sinatra, like, what are all the pieces of the puzzle from me being a client and sending a request to like / users? What are all the pieces along the way that it hits? And nobody has to be responsible for all the pieces. If you know any of the pieces, yell it out.
Rack.
So there's rack somewhere. There's a server. So there's the app, right? So Sinatra. Web app. Anything else? What's that? So yeah, there's DNS. Go.
For some reason, I always remember the Rails link.
Okay.
That I just mentioned.
Sure. And yeah, anything you know.
So right, it looks like your public folder first for static pages, and if you can't find anything there, you'll find something with the same name in your like development, in your like your views. So let's say you have index.html.erb and you're using that, but you have a static index.html in your public folder.
Yeah.
It'll look up the index.html before it gets to your.
So the web server in Rails has this public folder. We'll talk about that in a second. Anything else in Sinatra?
You might have, like, it's not really part of the request, but there's a database.
Yeah. So we need a database back here.
Resources.
Anything else? Okay. I would say here there's got to be some kind of routing function.
Oh, so like get requests.
What do you mean by routing? Like we get requests?
So if I say I'm going to /users, right,
Controller.
it's going to go like all the way along, right, and Sinatra has to decide like which of your routes to respond with. So I would say routing, and then kind of you could call this somewhat of the same function. You kind of have like the routing, and the routing is going to determine like which controller is going to respond to it and which route it belongs to. Then it's going to hit kind of Sinatra and like templating right in the database somewhere along the way as well. All right, cool. So we have like some requests, right? It's like some GET request to /users. It hits the web server. The web server passes along to Rack. Rack formats it into some standard hash. Then Sinatra says, which route do I need to respond with this? Which controller should I pass this along to? So this is kind of like inside Sinatra. It's hard to really say where this literally belongs. And then Sinatra is kind of responsible for like sending back some HTML, and maybe it needs to talk to the database to figure that out, and then goes all the way back through the same stack, and I get some web page, right? Okay, so what does this look like in Rails? Pretty much the exact same thing. So I have some client. I have some GET request to /users. It's going to hit a web server. As Gil pointed out, we have this public directory now. So if we have any static content in here and the request is for static content, it'll just stop here and get returned. That's the exact same thing that happens in Sinatra. Then it's going to talk to Rack. Then we're kind of in Rails land here, like the web app. And under that, right, we have the router. We have a controller. And we have a database. So the hope was, like, through doing all of this in Sinatra, these high-level pieces, and from talking to a lot of you guys yesterday, I think we're, like, pretty good on a lot of the high-level pieces of the puzzle. It's really not that different in Rails. This is sort of the same exact stack. We basically built the Rails stack in Sinatra so we could understand what all the pieces are. All right, so all of that stuff we kind of manually had to put together in Sinatra, right? Like in Sinatra, all you really have is an app.rb. Then we like sort of threw on Ratpack or some kind of generator to give us a lot of that stuff. We had to include the rake tasks. We had to like add an environment file, like all this stuff. And all this should really come for free in Rails. So if some of you followed my instructions yesterday, I wanted you to play with these generators. So Rails can generate a scaffold for you. And this is one of those things that I both want you to use and I don't want to use. So at first, like, let's use the scaffolds. They're really nice. They do a ton of work for you. And then once we kind of like understand them, I kind of want to get rid of them because I want people to like understand all the individual pieces and not rely on the generators. So we'll generate a scaffold. And what we're doing is we're generating all of the pieces of the puzzle, that whole stack, for a specific resource. So the resource could be like books, or it could be like posts, or it could be users, or it could be some noun in your domain. So let's make, we'll make posts, and with a lot of these generators, people will ask me, like, does it make sense to try and memorize kind of like what the syntax is of the generators? I always say yes and no. Some parts of it I find are super easy to memorize, other parts are not. If you can't memorize this stuff, you can either look it up, or a lot of it is sort of superfluous. And if you don't get it right in the generator command, you can just go in and edit the files yourself. But this is like the full command. So you can say Rails G, short for Rails generate. Then you give it which type of thing you want to generate. I want to generate a scaffold. What's the resource that I want to generate is post. That should be singular. And then I can tell it what are the attributes of a post. So a post maybe has a title, which is a string. And let's just do just that for now. So again, every time you run one of the Rails generators, it's going to tell you all of the stuff that it did for you. So back in the day in Sinatra land, when we were trying to like create CRUD for one resource, you had to do like a whole ton of stuff, right? And the nice thing about the scaffold is it should do all of that stuff for us if this works. I don't know what's going on.
I was actually going to ask you about that. Sometimes Rails takes like a really long time to generate something.
I've never seen it take this long to generate something. I feel like something.
You did.
What?
Rails G scaffold pro title.
It's not working for you either?
It is. It works. It made a test unit for us, ERB for us.
See if it worked. No, hasn't done anything yet. Okay, it's totally frozen. I don't know what's going on. Try it again. It is running Ruby. There we go. Thank you. This is weird. All right, I'm gonna try this again. What do you do? What? What do you mean default? I'm giving it like key value pairs. I'm saying like title colon string is the type of thing it is in the database, and then like a list of. This is crazy.
When you do title string, it's creating inside what we meant that file or integration.
It's doing a whole bunch of things, which I'll talk about as soon as I can get this to work. Yes. Yeah.
So I know it makes a model. Does it make a migration?
Yes.
So you like associate with the scaffold? You want to like add something inside your model?
No.
So like,
Yeah.
if at any point like you didn't want it to scaffold one of those things, you can like flag it to not like. Let's say you didn't need a database on that. Just like do everything but database.
Sort of.
That seems like a lot more work than just telling it to not do everything about
Somebody want to just post to GitHub like a Rails app with scaffold for this build? I don't know what's going on. I'll just clone it. Because I have all my notes on here and I know my computer.
Also reflected in the lead. Is that a crash report?
This might fix it. That's the only thing I did different than you. That takes a while. That I went through
I would never
We
even
made
think
a
about
new earlier. I was running into the same issue, and I had to do a gem update.
Why would I run this? Like you. Plus, like they can monitor like. Why do I need that? Oh, you have to.
What's that?
It's working over here.
Instead of G, I played generate.
Yeah, I posted it on Slack too. But yeah, I did it with generate.
Yeah, I've tried all of them. All right, cool. So unfortunately, you can't see all of the stuff on my screen that it generated, but hopefully you saw all the stuff on your screen that it generated. And so let's sort of like walk through like all of the stuff we need to complete a request and all of the stuff that we got. So the web server is just given to us for free, right? Like we have WebBrick, or you can install the gems like Thin or Unicorn or some web server. Rack is included for free. And then the first thing that we got to worry about is routing. So before, the way we did routing, right, was we were in AppRB or in one of our controllers, and we would list out individual routes, and that would tell Sinatra like how to respond to a request. So I can go into my routes file, and what this is a list of all of the routes that Rails is going to generate for me. So again, like one of the nice things that Rails does is it tries to consolidate stuff that's super common with nice little kind of generator commands. So rather than writing out like in Sinatra, I would say like a get request to slash, what was it? Posts, and and then that's going to do X or Y or Z. What I do in here is I just write resources posts. And you'll notice that this came for free, right, with the scaffold. So I didn't actually like type this into the routes file. This was already there when I opened it up after I ran the generator. So the generator knows all of the things you know to make like a resource for whatever specific object you're talking about. So the cool thing about this is not just one route. This is actually, I think it's 8 routes. These Rails guides are amazing. I recommend you read all of them, but in particularly this routing one is fantastic. So we've talked about this idea of resources, and that's kind of what REST is all about. REST is about manipulating these resources and using these semantic definitions of get, post, pat, put, and delete, along with the correct sort of RESTful URLs to manage these resources. So if you just type resources photos or resources posts or whatever, you get these 8 routes for free. So you don't actually have to define all of these routes. These routes are defined for you. So if you send a get request to /photos, it's going to route it to the index action of the photos controller. This is super, super useful. And also a lot of Rails, they say it's convention over configuration. So if you follow the conventions, all of like that whole stack will work together really well. And a lot of like Rails generators requires you to use sort of each piece of the generator stack. And if you don't use it, Rails will often get confused. So a lot of times it frustrates me that like when we move to Rails, like we start using these resourceful routes, and people forget immediately that all the resourceful routes is Rails is actually generating these standard routes that we were doing in Sinatra. So none of this is magic. It's actually generating those routes. And it's useful to use the resourceful routing because a lot of the other stuff that Rails is going to do for us requires that you do it that way. But a lot of times what I ask people to do is kind of like either write this out or you can go to, where is it? Rails info routes. So I can start up my server. So Rails S is basically shotgun. We'll start up my server. By default, it's going to use WebRick. And one of the routes that I get for free is this Rails info routes. And what this will tell me is all of the routes. Nope, need to run my migration. So this will tell me all of the routes that Rails auto-generated for me. So from the guide, I can find out what are the routes that Rails is going to auto-generate for me when I type resources photos or resources posts. And then in my actual app, it will tell me all of the routes that it has auto-generated. So it's super important to know what are the routes that you have because the most common question that you're going to run into is like, my app doesn't work, right? Like, why is it not doing the thing that I want it to do? And so what I'm going to challenge you to do is to walk through the flow, right? Okay, so what did you think it was going to do, right? Like, which route was it hitting, right? What was the request that you made? Which controller should it have hit? And like walking through the flow and having this mental model of like what's happening through each step is so crucial. And so I want to like really, really emphasize that as we move to Rails, don't forget everything that we did in Sinatra. Like we learned all of these concepts, and now Rails is doing them for us, but they're still happening. So if you have a problem, it's because Rails auto-generated something in a way you didn't expect, or you're not aware of what it auto-generated, or something like that. So if you want to know what it's doing for you, come to this route and be very specific about what are the routes that I have now. Yeah.
So I assume like you wouldn't want like your end user to be able to see this. This only exists in development.
Yeah, I've never actually tried to go to it in production, but I assume you can't hit this in production.
Yeah. So like in a lot of these routes, you might not want to use them all. You probably don't want them to be accessible. So it's like you just say, well, I only really want edit and
Yeah, so like when you do the resourceful routing, there's all sorts of little.
I guess in the controller you can say like, you know, just users logged in, like users add or whatever, like what's the issue not here.
I forget where it is, but I mean it's somewhere in here. There's parameters you can pass. So this is resources is a method call. Like all things have to be in Ruby. So it's a method call that takes one argument. It probably takes multiple arguments, and you can pass it like probably an array of actions that you say only generate like these actions, or like I think you can give it a hash that's like except, and then don't generate these for me or something to that effect, and all that's in the guides. All right, so sometimes looking at this is like slightly complicated, so let's just like talk through exactly what's going on here. So what we're saying is we got these 8 routes for free, and these 8 routes are a GET request to /posts, and then the parentheses says anything after that is optional. So if Rails sees it, it will use it. If it doesn't see it, it will ignore it, but it'll still match this route. So what is posts parentheses dot colon format? So the colon is the wildcard, just like in Sinatra. So what this is saying is what this will match is so format could be something like JSON, right, or XML or PDF or something like that. So you're making a request for this resource and you're saying, give me a list of all the posts. That's a resource, and then you're telling it what format you want it in. And what's the most common format that people request? HTML, right? So almost always when we send a request to a web server, we're asking for HTML, right? But a lot of times you might ask for JSON now because that's kind of like the new standard. Rails has kind of become this API that serves up JSON. So you may want to be representing your objects in JSON so you can just tell it, hey, I want the posts resource, but dot like some format after it, dot XML, dot JSON, dot something like that.
What's the parentheses
That's an optional thing. So
it's the parentheses.
so it's basically saying like anything inside of here may or may not appear. I will match whether or not this thing appears or not. So it's going to match. It'll show you in the controllers, has a nice view of it. So it's going to match a get request to /post or a get request to /post.json. Both of those things are matched by this parentheses with like this sort of wildcard thing. So it's saying whatever I get after this, .json, .xml, .blake's format, whatever, it's going to assume that this is the parameter called format, and this may appear or it may not appear. The reason it's optional is because by default we want HTML. So you shouldn't have to call post.html. So we're saying this is like an optional additional format. Usually you're only going to specify it if you're doing the non-specific thing or non-standard thing and asking for a different format other than HTML. So these are super important, and it's one of these crazy things that like when you move to Rails, suddenly like people forget, and they'll just say, oh, okay, like params ID is this magical thing that Rails does, right? It just knows the ID of the thing, some magical way. And I really want to like emphasize, there's never any magic. Rails is doing the exact same thing that Sinatra and Rack were doing. Where might Rails get an ID from? Gil?
Your post objects.
So it could come from the body of the post or not the database.
I was gonna say like our ERB.
Oh god. Oh no.
Where would we get it?
Jim?
Well, I was the post route, the URL.
So yeah, so it's either the URL or the body of a post. Those are the only places parameters ever come from, right? So when we send a request, if we want to send data along with the request, we either send parameters in like the URL, right? We do something like posts/ID, right? And this ID is a wildcard. And then Sinatra, Rack, whatever you want to call it, says, oh, okay, you typed in not post literal ID, you typed in post 1, right? And then it says 1 must be the ID that you're talking about. So either that gets submitted as the body of the post, right, through some form, or it's in a URL. Always, 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 always. Parameters come from either the URL or the body of a post. Do not forget that. And that's how we did it in Sinatra, because there's no magic when it happens in Sinatra, right? Like you have to literally write out the route, literally write out the wildcard. The minute we moved to Rails, somehow it feels magical to all you guys, and now Rails just knew which ID you were looking for. Rails can't know anything that it hasn't been told by a link or by a programmer at some point. So in these routes are the exact same routes we've been doing in Sinatra. When you made a CRUD controller in Sinatra, it was doing the exact same thing as we're doing in Rails. Rails just generates these routes for you automatically. So when you see in the scaffold Rails saying post find params ID, right? You've literally written this in Sinatra, right? Everyone's written this, right? So it's coming from the exact same place, this ID, as it was in Sinatra. Please don't forget that. Yes?
So if I create a form with like this ID, it'll automatically know that it's that ID that I was referring to.
Yeah, I mean, if you send a form through with an ID as one of the inputs, it will be in the body of that and be in the parameters, just like in Sinatra. Okay, so that's routing. Source routes, optional parts of the route. Oh, another thing I want to mention is routes are waterfalls. And this has come up with some people, I think in the CRUD controller, it was relevant. So the order of the routes that get generated matters. So Rails is going to, just Sinatra and Rails, any sort of like routing algorithm is going to go top to bottom, and when it sees a route, it's going to try and match the first thing first, then the second thing second, third thing third. So a lot of times, some of you had like a get to posts ID above a get to posts new, and because this is a wildcard, it's always going to say anything after post slash I consider to be the ID, right? I've matched your wildcard thing. So if you have a get to posts ID, wildcard ID above your get to post new, you're never going to be able to get to post new. So that was something I think that a bunch of people ran into. So if you ever have a problem in your routes, where you feel like it should be hitting one route and it keeps hitting another, just remember that it's probably just out of order. Play with the order. The nice thing is when you do the resourceful routing, Rails just does it for you and will always put it in the right order. So unless you're doing your routes manually, you're less likely to run into issues with routing. All right, cool. Let's talk about a whole bunch of stuff that's like kind of irrelevant. So in the app directory is kind of like your stuff, like the real stuff, kind of the MVC stuff in the in your Rails app. So you have assets. For now, like let's more or less ignore these, except to say this is where all the static stuff in your app goes. What is static? Never changes, right? So most stuff in a web app is dynamic, right? That's the whole point, is to dynamically generate HTML and send it back. But some stuff might be static. I'll give you an example of something that's static. A 404 page. So if you have a problem in Rails, there's a standard 404 page that will send back. There's nothing dynamic about this, right? This is just HTML that has been written. It's sitting in a file. It will never change, right? So we don't need to like dynamically like run it through Rails and talk to the database or anything like that. It's just a file. It's sitting there. And so there'll be some web server sitting there that'll say, oh, you asked for a static file, or I need to serve you a static file. Let me just send this back to you. That typically, when you get more complicated, will live on a CDN, right? We said that like sending requests to Australia or wherever is actually like speed of light's really slow. So typically, you'll keep those static assets in servers all around the world so that they're close to people. So static stuff goes in here. So JavaScript, CSS, and images are typically the stuff that you keep in here. But for now, we don't really need to worry about that. Rails uses a thing called the asset pipeline, which is like super complicated. So we'll do a whole lecture on like how does it deal with static stuff and compile stuff and all that sort of stuff. So for now, don't really worry about assets. Controllers is a big one. So we did Rails G scaffold, and the scaffold created a controller for us, right? Because a controller is one of the big pieces in our stack. So first it's going to hit the router, right? And then it's going to hit the controller. So the router is going to tell it, hey, which controller is responsible for dealing with this resource and managing this resource? And then you have to figure out, okay, which action, so which controller, right? And then which action is going to respond. So we call these actions. That's a new term, but really not anything different than we were doing in Sinatra. So you have some route that matches to a controller and action. And this is sort of like our resty CRUD sort of thing that we do in Rails. So the nice thing about the scaffold is it gives you a CRUD controller for free. So what does that look like? So I can just go into all of the routes that are auto-generated or not.
You're right about that turbo links.
Oh, did you take it out, Giancarlo? Did you take out turbo links? You did? Okay, cool. Cool. So now I should have all of the RESTful stuff I might want to do with the post resource. So I'm at the index of all posts. I don't have any posts in the database right now. So I should be able to make a new post, right? Post just has a name and a title. So this is a form, right? So this is the new route, so /post/new. And I should be able to post this form, and it should be put into the database. How do I know where this form is going to post? Go. So I can inspect the element, right? Where the form is going to post is going to be determined by the action of the form, right? So it's going to post to /posts. and so I can send this along, right? And I should get a new post created in the database. It will redirect me to the show view of my post. So it sent me a browser redirect. I sent a new GET request to /post/1, and now I see the post that was created. Now I can hit back. Now I can see all the posts. If I want, I can edit a post, right? I can send a GET request to post1 edit, which gives me the form, right? I can change the title of the post. I can update it. I can come back, and then if I want, I can destroy it.
It took us like 2 weeks to do this in Sinatra.
Right. So there's a famous video that DHH made called the 15-minute blog. They basically builds a blog in 15 minutes. And this is basically like what he was showing, was that so much of this stuff is like common stuff that you want to do, and like why don't we just abstract it, right? Like you basically typed 2 commands, Rails new and then Rails G, and it created the database stuff, created the associations and the models. Sorry, not the associations. It created the models for you. It created the controller. It created the routes. So all of the like most common and the views. So all of the most common stuff, all the stuff in the stack that you need, Rails will do out of the box for you. So this, to me, is kind of like incredible. This is like the power of Rails. Like all of the stuff you want to do so commonly, somebody has written some kind of generator or shortener or something like that. It's essentially like drying up the idea of building a web app.
So now, if we had to use the word post, is the functionality the same of something else? Like, let's say we wouldn't have generated post, we generated like block. Would it be listing block?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So it follows that convention.
Yep. So the convention in Rails is the model is singular and everything else is plural, basically. So you have posts controller, because you're talking about multiple posts, right? The view, you're viewing multiple posts, but each one in the model is going to be a singular. You're going to be working with a singular post.
My post space just has a title.
So this the stuff that's in here comes from when Giancarlo generated his scaffold. You can give it arguments and say like title string. If you give it multiple key value pairs, it will generate a post model with multiple attributes.
So what did he do? Like,
So he must have done
Title string and content text.
Rails G scaffold posts title string name string what's the last one? Content yeah, it must be text. Text is like a longer field.
How would you, let's say, want to like add an app to like post? Well, we want posts to also have comments. When
Yeah,
we first
so
created it, didn't want comments.
So it auto-generated all this stuff for me, right? But we should know how all of this stuff works. So if I want to add something to the post now, if my generators work, I don't know if they will. I could say Rails G migration. So this side generated a new migration, and I could say add news to posts or something like that. This is not going to auto do it. You can memorize, like, the migration syntax has, like, magical incantations. You can give it with the name, and it'll auto-generate migrations for you. I find that that's a little too much, and I can't remember that stuff. So I usually just give the migration a name that's semantically meaningful to me. And then I come in here, and I just say add column to posts. What am I adding? Comments. Well, let's keep it because I called it news earlier. We'll confuse ourselves. And that's going to be a string. Then I can come in here. I can run my migration. But now there's a whole set to the stack that we haven't changed, right? So we changed the database level, right? Now we have to worry about the controller level, the router level, the view level. So if I come back, in theory, we could make Rails smart enough to like dynamically generate this stuff. But as you can see, a new post still only has a name, title, and content. So I added news, but it didn't magically figure out how to do this. So the question then becomes like, well, so what's the flow, right? Like, what's all the stuff that needs to change? And this is kind of like what the flow you have to get into whenever you want to make a change is. So we made a change at the database level. Then we have to say, okay, like we have to make sure the routes are good. It looks like my route is still good, so I'm still loading this form when I go to post new. Then after it hits the route, it hits the controller. Okay, so is it still hitting the right controller? So we want it to hit the post controller. I would think that it's not hitting a new controller, so it's going to the new action of the post controller. It creates a new post object, and then this gets automatically passed to the view, just like in Sinatra. So then we have to ask, okay, what does the post new view look like? So if we look at the new post view, what you'll see is there's a whole bunch of stuff that Rails has added kind of to ERB to help us out. So this all is Ruby code, right, evaluated in ERB, which is dynamically generating HTML. So what HTML is it generating? This HTML, right? So most of the time now, your views are going to be mainly Ruby code. And that Ruby code is going to be Rails helpers that are dynamically generating HTML for you because it's much easier. So rather than writing out this whole form, right, it just calls render form. So what's happening here is it's rendering something called a partial. So this is another way that like Rails allows you to sort of like dry up your code. You might want to render this same form from multiple actions. So rather than having two forms, what you do is you basically just render it from two different places. So if you give a view this underscore nomenclature, it's considered a partial, and you can render it from inside of a view. So it's like, this is my template, and inside of my template, I'm telling it to render something else. So you can render a whole bunch of little pieces and kind of put together a page that way.
So where is currently like inputs in that?
Yeah, so render, obviously, like, this is not magic. So what is it doing? It's rendering some partial. So in my post folder, I have to look for something that's titled underscore form.html.erb, and here it is.
So it's calling that file.
Yep.
It has like a default template.
So by default, like this is the template that's going to be generated with the scaffold. So I'll get rid of this for a second. This is the errors stuff, so it looks a little simpler. And we'll talk about forms this afternoon. Rails has super complicated form generators because what you'll find is you're going to spend most of your time generating forms in Rails, which is like not that fun. And forms kind of suck, but it's like one of the big ways we deal with user input on the web. So Rails, as much as possible, tries to make your life easy. It'll auto-generate these for you when you're using the scaffold. And all you end up doing is calling form4 and then giving it the fields that you want. So we have name, title, and content. So if I want to add that last piece that I just added to the database, I think I called it news. So if I change the view, so now we followed like the whole progression, right? The route didn't change, the controller didn't change, the main view didn't change, the partial ended up changing. So now if I reload this, it should generate different HTML for me, right? So this was the piece that was missing, right? So now I know when I make a change, I have to always like kind of like go through all of the pieces and make sure that all makes sense. So now when I submit this form, I have to make sure that the controller that's receiving it is able to handle that new data. So where is this form going to post? To /post, right? And I know that because I can see /post here. The method is post, so all that was auto-generated by that form helper for me. So now I can sort of follow the trail of breadcrumbs and say, okay, the new action submits to the create action, just like in Sinatra. And so what does create do? So create takes the parameters, mass assigns them to this new post object, and then tries to call save on it. I'll talk about what this respond to block does in 1 second, but let's just ignore it for now. So we create a new post, right? And typically you'd probably in Sinatra write something like this, right? Does that look familiar? You'd have some parameters hash. You would have created a whole bunch of HTML where each individual input, right, was nested inside like a post key. right? So you'd have like a post top level hash pointing to like a hash of all of the parameters for the post, right? And so this, I have to give you like a little bit of a history lesson here. So this is what it used to look like in Rails, and we call this mass assignment. So we have this active record keyword, right, new, and they can take in a hash, and it will mass assign all of these keys and values to an object, and then save it, right? All kind of in one magical little moment. So what people figured out was, okay, the standard flow in Rails was you had this new action, you had a form, and then you would submit that form, and then what people would do on the back end is they would just, whatever the form submitted, they would push it into the object and save it, right? So this became a huge security risk because what if I did this? What if I came in here and I created a new input? Right, because once I send something to the client side, I have no control over it. So they could do like post admin maybe. Oh, I didn't save it. Shoot. Well, I'm not gonna keep messing with it. But in theory, right, I could just like on the client side, I could add a little box for admin. I just deleted it by accident. And then I could submit the form. And then whatever I submit with the form, it's going to go to the server side, right? So I could have a little form where I add like an admin box and I click like a checkbox, or I add a 1 or something like that, or true or something like that. Because a lot of people in the database have forms for creating a new user, right? So if I'm like signing up for the service, I could add a field assuming that on your database side you had a column called admin that was a Boolean like true or false. And all I do is just when I sign up, I add this little form box, send it along, and I know that all you do on the back end is you just mass assign anything that gets sent in, and I can make myself an admin just by altering the form on the client side. Does that make sense? So people like figured this out, and then so Rails said, oh, okay, like that's probably like an insecure thing. So they moved to using whitelists. No, they moved to using blacklists. So every time you made a model, you used to have like a blacklist of anything you didn't want mass assignable. So for your user model, you put like at the top of the blacklist, I don't want admin to be mass assignable, so that people can't just like add that field and I'll just like, without thinking, add it in. And then people thought, well, that was insecure because sometimes people forget, right, to add stuff to the blacklist. So they said, rather than blacklist, let's move to a whitelist model. So whitelist means like by default, nothing is mass assignable. And I have to specify everything that I think should be mass assignable. And then they said, actually, that's like not secure enough. So they moved to this thing called strong parameters, and that's where we are now. Strong parameters, the thing with security is like, if you want it to be secure, it's going to be really annoying to use. Strong parameters, every time I use them, I'm like baffled by them. It takes me way too long to figure out how to do it. I often will literally generate a scaffold because the scaffold will auto do the strong parameters for me, and then I'll like copy that into a new thing. I just can't figure it out. I don't know why. Hopefully you guys are smarter than I, and you can figure out how these things work and then explain it to me. But what ends up happening is Rails active record has been changed, so you can't just do this anymore. If you do this, you get this error, can't mass assign, something like that. So what they changed it to is you call a method, and that method is defined at the bottom called post params. And what you have to do is you have to use this syntax, where basically you say the parameters are required to have this top level key called post, right? That's what we're used to. And then nested within them, I call permit, and I say here's the white list of attributes that are permitted. So again, that prevents if somebody adds in admin, it will say, oh, you don't have that on your list of permitted things, and reject the mass assignment. So this is like supposed to be the most secure way to deal with this. When you do something simple where you just have like a post and it has just a couple attributes, it's really relatively simple to figure this out. As soon as you have more complicated stuff come through, it's kind of like the rack thing where when you're naming your inputs in your form, you got to follow some weird incantation, and that will send things through the right way over the wire. It's kind of the same thing with this strong params thing. You have these weird sort of like hashes and arrays and combinations that you have to do to allow whatever your weird param structure is. So that's sort of the history of that. Cool. So what ends up happening here, right, is I just call post params and I create a new one. So if I've added a new thing to the database, I'm going to have to come down here and edit it down here and say, okay, I'm also going to permit this news attribute. And now I should be able to create a new object and call save. So let's see if that works now. So it looks like it worked, but you can tell that like the default index view now doesn't have my news attribute. So you kind of like keep following the breadcrumbs and you say, okay, like what are all the views, right, that are displaying these objects, and what do I have to change? So then you would come in here and you'd say, okay, like let me change the index view, and you would add like the news attribute of the post to the ERB.
So this favors like careful planning because like if you have this scaffold and all automatic, right?
Yes and no. What you'll find is that like the scaffold is really useful for like the first Rails project that you do, and then after that you'll never use it again, because what ends up happening is like it auto generates so much stuff that's not what you want. You'll spend more time removing stuff, and there'll be, every time you remove something, there's probably some dependency that you forgot about. So then you'll run it, it'll break, and you're like, where's that thing that's requiring this thing that I just took out? So it's really nice as a template. And I'll often like just like generate one because I forgot some little thing, how Rails does some little thing, and then I'll just like copy paste it. But you'll never really use it after probably tomorrow.
Unless we're always all our projects are bloggers.
Yeah, unless you only make like blogs. So, I mean, this stuff is all great, and a lot of the pieces you'll still use a ton. You can use the generators for like controllers, models, all that sort of stuff. But in general, you'll be writing stuff from scratch for the most part. Do you have something, Alex? Okay, cool. So we talked about controllers. Oh, let's talk about respond to. So when we talked about routes, we were talking about how you could respond with two different types of two different formats, right? So somebody could ask for like the list of posts, and that list of posts could be asked for in HTML by default or JSON. So respond to is this cool thing that Rails allows you to do, which is to say like for this resource, for this action, I can respond with all of these different format types, and this is how I will respond. So it'll respond with this block that you give it. So by default, what Rails will do is, like if you look at this index here, right, by default, it's going to look for the index view, render the index view in HTML and send it back. If you want to do something different, you can add this respond to block and give it two different ways that it can respond. So there's this data in the database, and I want to be able to send it back in two different ways. So I can say format.json and give it a block, and I can say render JSON at posts. So there's this render command that gets implicitly called anytime you sort of like go through an action, and it just renders the template. But you could tell it, rather than rendering the template, render some JSON, and that JSON I want you to render is this object. So it's basically going to take this object and call two JSON on it, and then send it back. So let's see what that looks like. So now I have like sort of like one route, and this is kind of the whole idea behind REST, is that you can have one resource, one route, and like have a whole bunch of different ways that you can represent that resource. So I can ask for the HTML representation of posts, right? And now I need my, gotta tell it I can respond with HTML. Or I can say, hey, it's not that I want you to represent posts as HTML. I want you to go to the database, just grab that raw data, convert it to JSON, and send it back to me in JSON format.
You could sort of have like API functionality inside your actual code just by taking HTML and just sending it as JSON instead.
It's not that you're taking HTML and sending it as JSON. You're taking raw data out of the database
Yeah.
and sending it as JSON or
Like
sending it as
basically,
HTML.
like have an API inside your just like raw code.
Yeah, it's really cool. Like this is a big idea. This is like the really like what REST is the idea that like you have one resource and you can have multiple representations of that resource. Let's take like a 10-minute break. There's a bunch more stuff that I want to walk through. I've been talking for a while. So let's say 11:28. Let's start up again.